For those of you who are joining us, we're going to start in about 30 seconds when everybody has been able to enter our webinar platform. All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Sharp. I'm the co-dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and it is my great pleasure today to welcome you to our webinar, The Planned Overhaul of Israel's Judiciary. This event is being moderated by our own Sharona Hoffman. She's a chaired professor. She directs our Health Law Center. She's a prolific writer and one of the most famous of all of our faculty. We're very, very happy that you're going to be moderating today. Today's event features Dr. Maitel Pinto, who Sharona will be introducing in just a few moments. But I'd like to start by thanking the Frederick K. Cox International Law Center at our law school. It's celebrating its 31st anniversary. It's a $4.5 million endowed center. In fact, it just got a new $1 million endowment for its immigration law clinic. So it's up to $5.5 million. It's one of the top rated international law centers in the country. And it hosts all kinds of events like this, but this is going to be one of the best of the year. This event is also being co-sponsored by our International Law Society and the Jewish Law Society. Those are student groups, and we're very thankful for your co-sponsorship. And I also want to do a shout out to Professor Anat Alon Beck for helping us organize this event. I should say before we begin that I've worked on judicial reform throughout the globe. And I have to say that the proposals for the changes to the Israeli judiciary really concern me. I therefore share your enthusiasm and interest in today's event. And so without further ado, let me turn it over to Sharona Hoffman.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. So our speaker today is Dr. Maitel Pinto. Dr. Pinto is a senior lecturer at the Tzfat Academic College School of Law and the Ono Academic College Faculty of Law in Israel. She's also a teaching fellow in law at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Dr. Pinto has an SJD and LLM from the University of Toronto and an LLB degree in law and government from Reichman University in Israel. Dr. Pinto has served as a law clerk to Justice Asher Grunis of the Israeli Supreme Court. In fact, he was the Chief Justice. During 2022, she was an Israel Institute visiting fellow at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Chicago, where she taught 3 courses about modern Israel. Dr. Pinto's research focuses on issues of discrimination and minority rights within multicultural societies, especially language rights, religious freedom, and women's rights. She teaches jurisprudence, constitutional law, administrative law, and gender. Now, for those seeking CLE, we will have a code that will appear in the chat at the end of the program. And also, we will hold questions until later, but please put your questions in Q&A. We will leave plenty of time for audience questions. So, Dr. Pinto, I thought we would start by simply asking you to explain the proposed judicial reforms in Israel.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, Professor Hoffman, and thank you for Professor Scharf and Professor Alon Beck. It's a great pleasure to be here. Before I'm explaining the plan, I would like to explain a bit about the Israeli constitutional structure, because it's very, very different from the American one. So we'll start in history. Basically, Israel is a parliamentary democracy, okay? And we have unicameral parliament. Now, when Israel was established in 1948, And the first Knesset, the Knesset is the parliament, the first Knesset was supposed to enact a constitution, a rigid and comprehensive constitution, as you know, from the US or other countries. But the parliament, the Knesset, didn't do that. There were a lot of controversies around, for instance, do we want equality for women or not? Do we want equality for the Arabs who were in Israel or not? How do we, what do we think about the relation between religion and state? There were a lot of controversies, and it was very, very hard to get into a compromise, to get into a common ground. And therefore there was one Knesset member, Izhar Harari, his name, and he suggested a compromise. And the compromise was not to legislate a comprehensive constitution, but instead to legislate basic laws. And the basic laws will be a quasi-constitution because they will protect the basic values of Israel or of Israel democracy, and they will present or protect the basic structure of Israel governmental system. So that was a compromise, and gradually we had till today 14 basic laws. Now, we were in the 50s. Now I'm asking you to go forward to the 90s. Okay, so in the 90s, I was in the, I think, 10th grade. And till the 90s, there was no basic law that protected human rights. I mean, the right to vote and the right to be elected were protected in one basic law, but other rights, such as the right to property, the right to life, the right to dignity, all of these rights that we have today, they were not in any basic law until 1992. So what happened in 1992 is that the Knesset, one member of the Knesset who was very enthusiastic, Professor Amnon Rubinstein, that's his name. I was honored to be his research assistant for many years. And when he was in the Knesset, and he was also a law professor, he was the dean of Tel Aviv faculty before he was a politician. And he was very enthusiastic about enacting a basic law, which is about human rights, which will protect human rights. So he managed to gather other politicians, not only from the left or from the central, but also from the right-wing politicians. And together, they decided to enact two basic laws, two very important basic laws in 1992. The first is the basic law of human dignity and liberty, and the second is basic law of freedom of vocation. And that was a constitutional revolution because it was the first time that we have two basic laws that actually protect human rights. And the second feature that is very important of these two basic laws is that they gave the authority to the Supreme Court of Israel to strike down legislation that violate human rights which are protected by these two basic laws. And that was a revolution because we didn't have it before. Before we had constitutional rights, only constitutional rights that were recognized as such by the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court was not able to strike down laws that violated human rights. So that's a constitutional revolution in 1992. And later on, now I'm asking you to be in 1994, later on, there was a bit of a controversy over the basic law of freedom of vocation. Why? Because we are in the late Yitzhak Rabin government, and Yitzhak Rabin is very enthusiastic about the Oslo agreements, and he wants, as much as politicians, supporting these agreements with the Palestinians in the occupied territories, or whatever else you want to call them. So he was very enthusiastic to get the support of the ultra-religious parties, political parties in Israel. And at the same time, in the middle of the 90s, there is mass immigration from the former Soviet Union to Israel. And many former Soviet Union citizens who immigrated to Israel like to eat and purchase a pork meat, which is not kosher in the classic Judaic approach, I guess. So what happened was that the Haredi, the ultra-religious politicians, were very against selling and buying pork in Israel. And there were a lot of little shops and chain shops who sold pork, and the ultra-religious parties were anxious to stop these shops, to stop them from selling pork. So what they did, they enacted a law that almost makes it impossible to sell and buy pork in these shops. And then the shop owners thought, well, we are in 94 and we know that we have the new basic law of freedom of vocation. So they went to the Supreme Court and they said, well, our freedom of vocation is very harshly violated. Please, dear Supreme Court, please strike these laws down. And that's what the Supreme Court did. It struck the laws down. And then the ultra-religious people, parties went to Yitzhak Rabin and said, oh, we're so angry about this whole basic laws and this whole constitutional revolution. We are sorry we supported it then, and do something so we will be able to control the import and the selling of pork or non-kosher meat in Israel. So there is another compromise to add an override clause to the basic law freedom of vocation. And the override clause, the meaning of it is that the parliament, the Knesset, can violate freedom of vocation only if it does so by legislating a law that is enacted in a majority of 61 Knesset members, which is one more than a half of the Knesset members in Israel. And it will say very clearly in the law itself that the law is violating basic law freedom of vocation. And that's the override clause in Israel. It was imported from the Canadian Constitution. It's very similar. The wording of the override clause is very similar, although in Canada the override clause is different because it's not relevant for some rights. And of course, in Canada we have federal government and two parliaments and other governmental arrangements and constitutional arrangements, which we don't have in Israel. So right now, from 1994, the idea is that we have two basic laws that give the authority to the Supreme Court to strike down laws which violate constitutional rights that are protected by these two laws. Now, till today, from 1992 till today, the Supreme Court of Israel invalidated, strike down, whatever you want to call it, only 22 laws. In most cases, it was not the whole laws, but only few provisions that were problematic from a constitutional point of view that violated human rights. So that's the short history, okay? And I did it very, very short. So please keep in mind that Israel lacks many common checks and balances, okay? We don't have a rigid constitution. We don't have a comprehensive constitution. Basic laws right now can be enacted even if they are enacted in a majority of 2 against 1. There is no I guess, official procedure that the Knesset has to follow in order to enact a basic law. We don't have 2 legislative houses. We have only the Knesset. We don't have presidential veto. We don't have a federalist structure. We don't have regional elections. We have direct, what is called direct or proportional elections. Israel is not subordinated to supranational courts like in some European states. Israel is not subordinated to multi-level supranational organizations such as the EU. And another very important factor is that the government in Israel, in all times, controls the parliament. The parliament is very weak because if the government wants to form a coalition, it has to have more than 61 or more Knesset members. Now, if the government has the support of 61 Knesset members, it actually controls the parliament. The parliament doesn't really have a lot of power in Israel. Okay, so here are this is the Knesset, the government, the court. You also have to take into account, if we're talking about history, the very recent history. Okay, we had not less than 5 rounds of national elections in 3 years. Okay, people in the last election were very tired of this whole process of elections. I know many people who do not vote in Israel because they are sick of going to vote. It is just it's very absurd for them to do that. And in the 4th round in March 2021, there was the Coalition of Change. It was formed by right, center, and left political parties. We had Bennett and Lapid as co-prime ministers, and this whole coalition was without Netanyahu and without his party, the Likud party. It was a very shaky coalition because it was very hard for the coalition to form any agreements about anything, because we had right political parties, center political parties, and left political parties. It was very hard, and this coalition fell down, and there was a 5th round of election in November, and then in the end of December, Netanyahu forms new government, the most right-wing government that has ever been formed in Israel. And in January 2023, Justice Minister Levin and Knesset member Rotman unveil a governmental plan for a constitutional reform, that's the way they call it, of the whole judicial system. Now here, this slide kind of present in short the whole idea of the reform. Okay, so The first very controversial issue in this reform, or the plan as I prefer to call it in the most objective way, the first thing is to grant the coalition absolute control over the appointment of judges and justices in all courts. So right now, the situation is before the reform, which I personally hope won't happen. So right now, the situation is that in order for any judge to be elected in any court, there should be an agreement between the Supreme Court judges, who are part of the committee that elect judges, and the politicians, who are also part of the committee which elect judges. So right now, the structure is that no judge can be appointed without a mutual agreement between the Supreme Court judges and the politicians. That's the current situation. Now, what the plan wants to do is to give more voice in the election committee to coalition members, to ministers from the government, to Knesset members from the coalition. And the fear is that in this way, the committee will vote or will elect only judges who comply to the norms that are adhered by the right-wing coalition. And why this fear is very valid? Because it's not only, they don't only want to change the committee, they also present the idea that every judge in Israel will be elected only after he or she goes through a hearing in which, I know it's very popular in the US, but it's a very strange idea to Israel structure, a hearing in which the judge is asked questions about a very political, controversial issues, and that the judge will have to say what he or she think about every political issue. So the danger is that only judges who are right-wing judges, and only judges who will be very close to the political party that has the largest voice in the Knesset, only these judges or these candidates will be elected as judges in all courts in Israel, not only the Supreme Court. So that's the basic fear. And keep in mind that in Israel, once a judge is nominated to every court, he or she must retire when they reach 70. Okay, so after 70, they have to retire exactly on the day that they reach 70. Okay, and that's an appointment for life. So if the committee will change, the fear of the people who are against this reform is that there will be many appointed of judges who will stay in the judicial system that will feel obligated to the politicians who voted for them, and will feel obligated to stay or at least not to deviate from the political values that they were elected to protect, basically. The second very controversial issue is that the reform wants to prohibit any judicial review of basic laws by the Supreme Court. Now, currently, the situation is that the Supreme Court of Israel is authorized not only to do judicial review on regular legislation, but also to do judicial review on basic laws. It's a very rare doctrine that allows the court to strike down basic laws when they violate or when they extremely violate the basic principles of Israel as a democracy and as a Jewish state. That's the doctrine. Now, so far, this doctrine were not implemented in any case in Israel. The only times in which this doctrine was implemented, it was implemented twice when the Supreme Court said that the basic law should be struck down because it was legislated for bad reasons, for reasons that are corruption, or that for reasons that aim to support a very narrow aim, which is not, I mean, it was not legislated in order to support basic rights, or in order to support other structure of other governmental structure. So the supporters of the reform wanted to be clear that if the reform will go through, that there will not be any judicial review of basic laws. This is, I think this is very dangerous, because we don't have any law that, or any basic law that entails a very formal process of what is it to legislate basic law. So basically, every law can be legislated as a basic law. It only needs a title of basic law. And the danger is that these basic laws that will be enacted will actually be immunized from any review, because the Supreme Court is the only is the only institute that is authorized and that has the power to do any kind of review. I will point just to another point in the reform, because I see that that we are already pretty. It's 7:30. Okay, so I will touch on point 6: politicizing and weakening the attorney general, and not only the attorney general, but every I guess every governmental legal advisor. So right now, the current situation is that we have an attorney general, and he has the authority to represent the government on the one hand, but also he has the authority to make investigations, for instance, of politicians. And so he's the authorities of the attorney general are very controversial in Israel, because he or she, currently it's a she holds kind of a contradicting authorities. On the one hand, she has to represent the government. On the other hand, she can make charges against politicians in the government, because she's the head of the whole idea of I don't know how to say it in English. I'm not a legal. I'm not a criminal. I'm not a criminal professor. So the word just slept, but I will get to it back. So basically, what they want is that the attorney general will not be governmental or a public employee, but from now on, he or she will be what is called trust position. Now, trust position is basically the authority to choose everyone I want, or everyone the coalition wants to be, or the prime minister wants to be an attorney general. And then if this is the case, and it can be everyone, and also the person who is elected to be the attorney general is not committed to the public because he's not a public employee, but rather he is an employee, a kind of an employee of the government, or mainly of the prime minister. So the fear is that the result will be that the attorney general won't or stop representing the interest of the people, of the public, and the only interest he or she will represent is the interest, the very narrow interest, political interest of the politicians who vote for them. And the reform is not only about the attorney general. It's also about all governmental legal advisors. So every governmental institute in Israel has a public legal advisor. Every minister has a public legal advisor who is a public employee. And currently, as public employees, these legal advisors are protecting the interest of the public, not the interest of the ministers who appointed them, because they are public officers, they are public employees. What the reform wants to do is to change the election process of all legal advisors in all ministers in Israel, to change them to, again, to be a trust position, so every minister can choose every person he sees fits to be his legal advisor. And the fear is that as private legal advisors, they won't think at all about the public in Israel. They will think only about the interest, or the very limited and narrow political interest of the relevant minister. And it's very dangerous, because currently in a lot of cases in Israel, the lawyers who protect the public interest are the legal advisors of the ministers. They are the one who knows when there is a very problematic case, for instance, of human rights violation, or when there is a very problematic case of corruption. And many times we, the public, don't know about it. And the legal advisors are the one who reveal the corruption or the harsh human rights violation. And once you change them into private legal advisors of every minister, the fear is that they will not do that anymore, because it's not in their interest. Their interest is to serve, and their only interest will be to serve the ministers who appointed them. So I'll stop here, although you see there are other points such as the override clause and undermining judicial review, and a lot of the unreasonableness clause. But I think now the 3 points that I've now presented are the one who are now the most controversial one, because the government pushed for them, and a lot of the public in Israel push against them. And a lot of the public in Israel right now is demonstrating against this 3 point that I've just mentioned. So I don't have time to talk about to talk more about other points, but maybe in the part of the questions and answers, I'll have time to give examples or to talk about other issues.
So thanks so much for that really thorough explanation. What is the status of these reforms right now?
So right now, if we'll go back to the points, so politicizing the judicial appointments, we're now in the phase in which the legislation of the reform already passed the first call, what we call in Israel the first call, the first vote. And it's a very dangerous situation because the first vote is the most important one. Once a legislation gone through the first vote, it can very easily go through the second and the third vote. So Benjamin Netanyahu said before Passover that because of Passover and other holidays that we celebrate, he will take a break. He will suspend the legislation or hold it, not suspend, hold it. But still, it's very dangerous because it's only a hold on this legislation. The legislation is still on the Knesset table. So it's very easy for the coalition, if the coalition will want to, or if the prime minister will want to, or if the minister of law will want to, who is Levin, it will be very easier for them to pass the second and the third vote. The other points that I mentioned, prohibiting judicial review of basic laws, this one also is in the phase, it passed the phase of first vote, and it's very likely and very easy to go through the second and third vote. This point of politicizing and weakening Attorney General and all legal, public legal advisors has currently, this point has not been in progress at all. But I mentioned it because there are now negotiations in the President's House, and the rumors are the negotiations are very secretive. I have my own criticism about it. It's very secretive. No one really knows what's going on there. And the rumors are that the coalition is also pushing for politicizing and weakening the Attorney General and other public legal advisors, that they want to push it forward, to legislate it, and to go through it at least till the first vote.
Yeah. And what would the implications of these reforms be for human rights in Israel, for Arab populations, Palestinian populations, and other populations?
So again, you have to remember that the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, is very weak. And you also have to remember that in Israel, we're not a neutral state. Okay, it's not like in the US, there is no separation between religion and the state. And Jewishness is not only a religion, it's not only a religious affiliation. It is also conceptualized in Israel as a national affiliation. And there is a chronic minority in Israel, which are the Arabs who are citizens of Israel. They are citizens of Israel, and they are supposed to have equal rights. And they have equal rights in most of our laws. So they have equal rights in most of the laws, but in reality, they're still very discriminated on daily basis. And in reality also, they have a very limited representation in the Knesset. Why very limited representation? Because till the Change coalition of last year, no Arab political party was part of the coalition. So Arabs were always only part of the opposition. They don't have a real political power in Israel. So the danger is that it will be very easy to enact, for instance, a basic law with a title that say, for instance, that there is an option to take citizenship of people who are, who are involved in terrorism or are suspected to be involved. And the slippery slope here is very, very slippery. It's very sharp, because once there is a legislation like this, and the Israeli Arab citizens of Israel are always always the prime suspect to be involved in terrorist attacks in Israel, and are always the prime suspect of not supporting Israel, because many of the Arabs in Israel find it hard to support Israel, because Israel is defined as a Jewish state. And it's very hard for Arabs to identify with this whole Jewishness idea. Of course, there is also a very prominent danger to women, to all women, because many political parties in Israel, religious parties, ultra-religious parties, right now they have a lot of power in the coalition. They, unfortunately for me, that's what I think, they gained a lot of political power in the 5th round in the recent election, and they already have all kind of suggestions about legislation that will allow to discriminate women in all kind of situations, to allow to discriminate, for instance, women or minorities on the basis of conscience. So if I am, for instance, saying that my conscience does not allow me to sell products to Arabs or to women, then the coalition right now has a proposal to turn it into a legal thing. Right now in Israeli current legislation, it is not legal. Even if we have a small shop, even if I own a small shop and I sell products, or I own a small club, I cannot discriminate between people, between my customers, on the basis of race, gender, and national affiliation. So the coalition right now has many proposals to change that and to allow basically the Jewish majority to discriminate against Arabs, against women. Of course, there are also the Palestinians in the occupied territories who Israel controls, and they don't have Israeli citizenship. And their daily life are very hard even to process, because Israel IDF is basically controlling a lot of their steps. So I think that for Palestinians in the occupied territories, it will even be worse. Their life is currently very, very bad right now. So it will be, I guess, extremely bad if this reform will happen.
And we've heard that the government is trying to set up a national guard. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So there is a very controversial minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the minister of internal security in Israel. There is the minister of external security, which is who is in charge of the IDF, the army, and such and such. And there is a minister of the internal security. And basically, the suggestions, the legislation that is in the process is to allow this minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, or other ministers who will be in these positions in the next coalitions, to have their private army, in the sense that they will be able to elect candidates to be part of the police force, and who will be authorized to I guess will be authorized to protect the public from mainly from terror attacks and from every, I guess, danger that the public is allegedly facing. And this is a very dangerous idea because so far we had the police, and of course that the Minister of the Internal Security is above the police, but the police has enough of authorities and enough of independence. The police is not dependent on every decision, is not dependent on what the Minister of Internal Security think. And once you make the police very dependent on the minister, and you also create a unit that is kind of a private army or private unit or private police that is especially authorized to deal with suspicions of terror attacks or with terror attacks. This is very dangerous because, as I said, the prime suspects always in Israel for terror attacks are the Arab citizens of Israel. They're going through profiling in a lot of circumstances, and it will only make their life worse in this sense. So I'm afraid that, for instance, they will follow my Arab students. They will say, "Oh, this is a young person. He's a student, and young person are more prone to violate practices or to terror." So they will have the authority to follow them or to narrow their steps. And this is not imaginative steps. I mean, it's very, very easy to imagine these things happening because they already happen. They just happen in a small scale. Once we have this private army, it will happen in a very large scale.
So we are getting some questions in the Q&A. Please feel free to add more. One is from Professor Anat Alon-Beck. Are these proposals having an effect on Israel's standing in the international community?
Okay, so I'm not an international legal scholar, but there is this very basic idea that international courts tend not to investigate states for let's say war crimes, for instance. They tend not to investigate them, the international courts, if they know that there is an internal process of investigation, an internal process of judicial review. And right now, Israel's Supreme Court is very recognized around the world as an institute that is doing this investigation, that is doing judicial review on very, very delicate issues, on terror, on crimes, on wars. And once we take the authority from the Supreme Court, the fear is that the international bodies, the international courts will say, well, now we cannot really say that Israel has an independent judicial system. Now we cannot trust it. And my fear is that international courts will start to investigate people, like me, by the way, who were officers in the army, who were involved in combat activity in the army. And right now, international courts do not do that because they respect the Supreme Court of Israel. But once it's very clear that the Supreme Court of Israel is comprised of judges who are not really independent, who kind of very, very dependent on the politicians who nominated them, then we don't have any independent judicial review. We don't have any independent courts at all. So that's the fear that I can talk about. But of course, there are others. There are other issues that I'm not expert on. So
we have a question from Professor Avidan Cover. Is it the case that there has been little to no Mizrahi representation on the High Court? And Mizrahi, for those who don't know, has to do with people who are from Arab countries in origin rather than of European origin. So people from Yemen and Morocco and other countries. If so, to what extent has this been a cause of some frustration with the court and therefore a cause of some of these proposed reforms?
Thank you very much for this question, Avidan. By the way, I'm a Mizrahi Jew. Both my parents immigrated from Egypt. And of course, there is a lot of, it's true, there are not a lot of Mizrahi judges in the Supreme Court. That's a huge problem, has always been. But, and that's the big but, the reform is not about it. I mean, the suggested reform will not, the result of the reform will not be more Mizrahi judges. It will be more judges who are dependent on the politicians who form the coalition, but there will not necessarily be Mizrahi. And I think that if the people who support the reform really want Mizrahi representation in the Supreme Court of Israel, they would have suggested other suggestions, like, for instance, to do a kind of affirmative action process in the committees that elect judges. So it will be clear that the committee has to, once of, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, promote or elect a Mizrahi judge. And the very cynical thing is that the first female Mizrahi, Jewish Mizrahi judge who was elected was actually elected last year by the coalition of change. And the one of the person who was very against it was Simcha Rotman. And Simcha Rotman with Levin is the great supporter of this reform. And they represent it as if the reform is about helping the Jewish Mizrahis in Israel, Mizrahi Jews in Israel. And that's not true. I'm actually involved in a lot of Mizrahi Jews organizations. And of course, we want more representations for Mizrahi, not only in the judiciary, also in the academia, in other issue that we have almost non-representations of Mizrahim, but the reform is not about it. So the problem exists, but it will not be solved by the reform.
So could you talk a little bit about the demonstrations in Israel? I believe they have been of unprecedented scope and pretty impressive, actually, for those of us watching from the outside.
Right. So we have something like 9 million of citizens in Israel, and every Saturday evening we have something like 500,000 people who demonstrate all over Israel. There is this very big demonstration in Tel Aviv, which is called the Kaplan demonstration. But there are also other smaller demonstrations of thousands of people, for instance, in the town that I live in Herzliya, in Kfar Saba, in other places in the north. I know because I'm invited to deliver speeches in these demonstrations in order to explain the consequences of the reform and why that's what I think, why we have to oppose the reform. So right now, the demonstrations have a lot of impact, and they gain more and more impact within the public. The only, well, not the only problem, but one of the problems is that the Arab minority, the Israeli Arabs, the Arabs who have Israeli citizenship, some of them do take part in these demonstrations, but a lot of them do not. And it is, some people think, some Jewish people think, well, they don't care and they let us, the Jews, to protect their rights. But I think that this is not true. Personally, I do not recommend any Arab to participate in these demonstrations because the police tend to do profiling, and they will be the first one who will be investigated, who will be arrested. It is always the case. So I don't think that we need the Arab minority to actually participate in the demonstrations. It's enough that they will say that they oppose the reform. Another problem is that the Arab minority has no political representation in the negotiations that right now take part in the President House because they were not invited to these talks. And of course, they're not part of the coalition. So basically what we have in the President House right now is Jews negotiating with Jews on the rights of minorities, of Arab, of women. I'm saying also women because the representation of females in this government is very, very small. So we have very, very small number of female ministers. We have a very small number of female Knesset members. So we also have very few females who are actually taking active part in the negotiation process in the President House. So personally, I think that these all negotiations are a game. I don't think that Levin or Rothman will do any compromise. So I think they're pretty much useless. But other people think otherwise. Other law professors think they do have chances.
So we have just maybe 2 minutes left, and I've gotten a couple of questions, one from Anat Beck, one from Liraz Levy, about the Kahelet organization. So
Right.
What is that? What is its relationship to the coalition? Just very, very briefly.
Okay, so Kohelet organization is basically an organization that I'm very familiar with for over 10 years. But the public right now, it's gaining the attention of the Israeli public only recently. It's a private organization. They represent themselves as a think tank, as a body that do research. They are supported mainly by Americans, donators. The rumors are that most of the donators are evangelist Americans, and they have a very, very clear agenda. And the agenda is very, very, as I see it at least, is against judicial activism, is against human rights of minorities, It is very, very right-wing from an economic perspective. It's about less and less, less and less government control on the market. So people like me who are politically left-wing and also economically left-wing, who think that the government does have to be involved in the economy because otherwise there is a lot of poverty. So people like me are very against them. They were also known to promote public policy that allows discriminating women, that allows more authorities to rabbinical courts. So for the audience, I don't know if you know, but matters of divorce and marriage in Israel are not going to regular courts, they're going to religious courts that are that implement actually religious norms in disputes between couples or family disputes or whatever. So so Kohelet supported, for instance, the idea to broaden the authority of these religious courts so they will be able to judge also on issues that are not directly related to marriage and divorce, but also related to custody of children, which are currently in the authority of the regular courts and not the rabbinical courts. Also in matters of economic disputes about property between couples, which are currently under the authorization of regular courts and not rabbinical courts, but Kohelet supports the idea to give them the authority also about these secular issues rather than divorce and marriage.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to have to end. Eric, do you have CLE information?
I do. If you want to say goodbye, and I'll provide that after you say goodbye, and thank you.
Okay, well, we want to thank everyone for attending. You will get the CLE information momentarily. Michael, do you have anything to add?
I just thought this was terrific. Thank you, Maitel. Thank you, Sharona, and we'll see you at the next event.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.